So the tool itself is pretty straightforward. Our whole goal is to basically put data on a mapping interface that you can jump in without having to learn GIS and all the underlying parts of the data itself. So the map is fully interactive. You can click and drag the map around. You can zoom in and out. You can use a little navigation button on the right-hand side. If you don't have a mouse, we do have most of the tool itself is handicap accessible for certain types of uses. So it's fully keyboard interface. The two search bars in the very top are ways to navigate the tool. So the location bar on the right works like a Google Maps, where you're going to either type in an address and it will zoom to the address. It'll drop a little pin on that location, and then you can now work from this point that you just added to the map. The search bar, though, is also a bit of a geo search or geography search. So you can type in a place like Missoula. And in this case, what it'll do is it'll show you the different geographies that would match your keyword. So in this case, there's the county and, of course, the city itself. So the goal of the search bar on the very top really is to identify a location. With using the maps part, it's going to try to zoom the map to the location that you're working on. As we get further along, you're going to realize this search bar is really important because it also allows you to isolate locations for things that you're trying to download data or query data against. The map, once you have the location situated, the next step really is adding data to the map. And that data is listed in these categories above the map. The My Data, it will be any data sets that you've created, either using the data loader, which we might not cover in today's session, but we can at any time, or data sets that have been shared with you from other users, or as well as data sets that we process for your organization. So My Data is pretty much a customized tab for each person. Another thing that we originally just called boundaries before, but we really consider data, is actually boundaries. So this allows you to overlay boundaries that you probably are familiar with when you're searching up here, but then you also see that there are some very unique boundaries in here at the same time. So that way you can see something very simple like census tracts in the map. Whoops. And now you can start seeing what census tract boundaries look like. One of the really neat updates to PolicyMap is you can combine or add multiple boundaries. So if you ever want to see something like how block groups sit within a census tract, you can add those two together. And now you can start seeing how block groups actually sit within a census tract. So this allows you to do some really cool things where you can actually now customize the boundaries and start seeing containments. So in this case, you'll see the blue boundaries are the census tracts, and then the black boundaries that sit within the tracts are the block groups that are contained within them. And then, of course, other boundaries in here as well. So this is a neat place to see. We'll talk about custom boundaries in a moment, but we'll get through the data parts itself. The rest of the tabs are the data itself in the tool. Each category, we try our best to kind of group together data that makes sense in those categories. I won't get into much detail some of these categories. I'll try to highlight a handful that might be of interest in your use. But the first thing you'll probably want to notice is that the first sub-menu or subcategory sub-menu in every one of the categories is what we call a point data set. So what you're going to find out in the tool is that we have two types of data that you can interact with. Point data sets are just that. They're points in the map, which represents an icon, and the icon in this case are little squares that represents a grocery retail location. So point data sets for us is an address data set. Everything else after that in that category or in any of the categories are then what we call data layers. And layer data, I always pick a terrible data set to choose from. Layer data is data that's aggregated to geographies, and it's the colorful maps that you're familiar with when it comes to looking at data. So you'll see that layers and points can be displayed in the map at the same time. Layers and points also have their own legends, and as we get through this, you'll see that the legend is a really powerful way to start customizing the data. So without going into too much of the categories itself, if you do want to learn about some of the categories that we have in the tool, this link in the very top right corner here, which I will send to everyone in the follow-up email, is our data directory. And what this page tries to do is summarize all those categories that you just saw. And the way it works is as you get down, you'll eventually get to a table of contents which mimics the categories. And then when you enter one of the categories, which is not the right link, of course, my site's running slow on me. Oh, it did take me there. Oh no, let's find another one. There we go. Once you get to a category, it'll give you a very broad summary of what you're going to find with that. So in the case of education, it's going to tell us that we have school data for performance schools. We have just general public schools themselves. We have private school data points, colleges, universities, and then we have aggregate data, including things like enrollment, attainment, education attainment by race, and so forth. And so what this page is trying to do is give you a very broad summary of the category, but hopefully it'll give you a chance to better understand what you're going to be able to find within some of those categories. And then once you get into these sections, what you'll see is some hopefully helpful tips about the data that you're trying to utilize. So things like what years are available for the data. An easy rule of thumb for us is that we do start our data at 2000. We do not have historical data at this time. It's something we are looking for hopefully next year. And then we'll have the most current census or ACS data in here. And then probably one of the more important things, especially for what you guys do because you're a little bit more rural in your work, is the aggregation level that's available for data itself. So in this case, educational attainment is available at the block group level for all the years available, and then available at larger geographies like tracts, county subdivisions, counties, zip codes, and such. All right, so a neat place to go just to get a little bit of information about the data itself. So let me just take a quick pause. And is there any certain data sets you would like to see in particular and just see how it works in the map? And we'll focus into that a little bit for you as well.
I just have a broad question. When are you going to upload Census 2020 data?
That should be by the end of the month. And the only reason why it's taking us so long is that we're doing a comparison, historical comparison. So instead of just putting the 2020 data, you'll be able to actually see how it changed between the 2010 census as well as the recent ACS.
Okay, wonderful, because we're getting a lot of information from census being city county government. I would just share that with you. So I would love to see that uploaded into PolicyMap. So, and that comparison data will be awesome to have over the years. So that will be great. I just wanted to open it up to the team to see if there was a data set that anybody wanted Phil to build out for you or for your program or agency. Something that you've been mulling over. Anyone? And if not, I can throw one out there.
Yeah, and I have some for you guys as well, but yes.
Well, I'm going to take the silence as nobody has anything to share. So in our community, we're doing a lot of work around JEDI, which is Justice, Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. So if we could build out a data set around race, that would be really great, with also looking at maybe some kind of housing measure, if possible, and neighborhood. So like cost burden, for example, would be interesting. So because around rentals and homeowners, and if race plays a factor into that, if there's more people that are cost burdened based on their race or not, to know that if that existed as a problem in our community or as a disparity.
Perfect.
Just an idea.
That's a great lead. So we'll dig into that. So just thinking about trying to find those three indicators, could be challenging, because if you really don't understand the way we organize some of the categories, it might feel daunting as where to go to find something very simple as racial characteristics. Some simple things you probably are familiar with. So demographics will have some basic things that you might understand, which is population and race and such. You'll get further into categories, and you'll see we have some pretty unique ways to look at race as well. So foreign-born, immigration, language spoken at home, some very unique challenges, as well as family and household types in that data set. And again, the goal of the data directory page is trying to give you a very broad summary of these categories. But an easy way to get to data is the other search bar on the top left. And this allows you to type in a handful of keywords. So maybe you're trying to find diversity data within our data sets, I think. So in this case, it'll try to use the metadata that we have for our data sets and find maybe a handful of data sets that might make sense in what you're trying to query against. And this is probably one of the coolest data sets. I don't know how this is going to look in Missoula because the way this data is structured. Well, let's find out what it looks like. Yeah, that's what I figured. So this is a really neat data set. I think if we pan out a little bit, we might see a little bit of distinction around the area. But the way this data works is that in the census, when it tries to show you racial characteristics, what it does is it only tries to show you one race at a time. And we definitely understand the challenges of seeing just one map of one race. And you want to start being able to see how the different races mesh together within a neighborhood. And so we took that and created this really neat predominant race index. And basically what this is trying to show you is that anything, in this case blue, are predominantly white. The uniqueness of this map for you maybe is that some of the light colors, in this case, this particular zip code here, and we can actually zoom in and lock this. So this particular track here, while it's predominantly white, it's actually not the majority, so there is a bit of diversity in this particular track. But a very simple one, then, of course, if we stick back into ethnicity, is you can start looking at this data as individual races or non-white, which is also the other way to look at the other side of that spectrum. Probably one of the neat features, probably one of the more unique features you're going to want to use, especially in the areas that you're working on, is this lock feature that we added recently. Because what this will do is it'll lock census tracts onto the map. Because of what you'll see if we played this a little bit, is that the map always tries to redraw based on the zoom, only because it can only render so much data before it kind of slows down a little bit. But because you face challenges of how rural some of your neighborhoods are, this allows you to lock the geography, so that way you can start zooming out and see census tracts basically in a constant. And so this map is a very simple map. This is going to tell you that anything in the dark purples are areas that have, looks like 70% or more of the population are people of color. And versus the lighter colors as well. So this is one layer, and we're going to start really talking about how to overlay these things together. But if we take this one layer, we can do some really unique things about one layer at a time, and that's all done within the legend itself. So when you first add a layer data, you have a title in the very top. Very simple. It's going to give you what the title of the data represents. The eye icon in here used to be what we call our data description. And this will be very helpful because when you start adding some of these more index types of data sets or data sets that require a bit of calculation to get to it, this will give you the calculation to get there. So in this case, this is trying to explain what qualifies as a person of color, and of course the denominator to get to that value. And then the legend will then also give you some really unique ways to customize the map, from changing the year, the variable, which is probably one of the most unique ways to change some of our census data sets. For us, the default variable for most of our census data is the percent, meaning because when you look at a map, it's sometimes better to see the percentage of the overall population, especially if you're in a more populated area. But again, for the bit of work that your team generally does, you're much more rural in that work, and so you can actually flip this to count, which is number of persons that are or persons of color. So one thing we haven't locked is changing. Sorry about that. And so now instead of looking at the percentage of people that are persons of color, now you're still looking at the number of persons. And then from this, you can start seeing where the concentration of people are versus just the percentage of persons of color. If we can also isolate individual ranges, another just very unique way to be able to, well, that one has no color, be able to just isolate one or two ranges at a time, giving you a chance to kind of show a much more simple map to your audience. So that way they don't have to look at all the other places. They can just identify with just a handful of, in this case, tracks that you're trying to focus their attention to. You can also customize these ranges too. So initially the default ranges you here is just a quintile. And all that means is that our system takes the total number of geographies and divides them up evenly into fifths based on density of data. So this histogram will show you, if I change this real quick, that majority of the data really is within this almost less than 1,000 persons range. So meaning that if I were to slide this out, we're going to not get many places that have tracks that actually have over X amount. So the histogram is really unique and helpful because this allows you to then, when you do make your own ranges, to understand where those cut points might exist from. So we can bring this number down to, let's say, whoops, below 100. And so the cut points are, for our use, much more specific, but it also simplifies it for your audience. And that's one of the unique functions of the legend, is that you have a lot of control of what's being presented on the map. And this can greatly affect how you're presenting data to the person or the audience that you're trying to show data to. All right, let me take a quick pause about the legend for data layers. Hopefully all that makes a little bit of sense, but if you have any questions, let me know. All right, so I'm going to show you data points, and then from there we'll talk about how to do some really neat ways to overlay multiple data sets together. So as we kind of build upon what we learn as a tool. So data layers is probably, oh no, are you locking up audio-wise or video-wise? That's not good. Anyone have any audio problems? Video problems?
I can just now hear you again. It just locked up on me. It could just be my connection.
Oh, all right. Well, it's recorded, so that way, you know, you can always rewatch it again. I do apologize. It's trying to find that median web conference tool for everyone is always a challenge sometimes.
For sure.
Yeah. All right. So the legend is there's a lot of really unique ways to customize the data in the legend. And I'll show you points, and points is probably one of the easiest ones as well. And then we're going to show you how to put these two things together a little bit. In the case of points, I'll add a really simple one. Maybe we'll do something like subsidized housing, so you can start seeing some of the different federal programs we have in here, which includes low-income housing tax credit points. So a point data set is really just that. It's little icons on the map. Each icon represents an address for that particular location. We do have these really new functions, which is a cluster points, allowing you to see if there's multiple points in one location. Clicking on to a point or cluster, you'll have the ability to expand on the data a little bit. So in this case, this is Main Street, apartments. You have more information about the LIHTC site, more information about the dollar amounts, allocation years, number of units, and funding, and so forth. In this case, every one of these addresses has a wealth of data to interact with. And so what we wanted to do is turn some of this data into ways that you can filter the points that are on the map. So initially, when you first add a point data set, you're going to see 100% of the points based on your extent. So if we were to zoom out, you'll see more points appear on the map in this case. And then the legend allows you to query or filter the points to just the handful of ones you're trying to identify. Probably one of my favorite queries that we added to the new platform is the data search query. So in this case, you can initially start by typing in, whoops, sorry. Am I just really spelling your state wrong? I apologize. Oh, maybe there aren't any places called Montana in this data set. That's why. Okay. Let's see. Oh, I can't query it. Normally, without my site going off on me, you could just query and search by the title or the name of the site itself. So I should be able to type in hillside, and it'll actually query by. Oh no! All right, everybody's having problems with this session. I apologize. We'll figure this out again. Maybe we try this again. So in the case of the data search, this you can query by name or title, and that way it'll actually simplify the search in that function. But more importantly, you can actually query by the data within the sites itself. So in the case of LITEX, you can search by the number of points on the map, meaning you can say, I just want to show sites that have over 100 sites. And in this case, it'll just show a handful of sites that have over 100. In this case, it's the apartments. Maybe it isn't everyone else and just me as well. I'm having internet issues right here. The other function of this is that you can actually query by a bunch of different types of categories at the same time. So in this example, if you wanted to show total number of units that contain both 51 and more than 100, you can combine the two together, and this will show you all the points that have both 100 or 51 and up to more than 100. And then the filters, you can color code them by all the variables together. So this now gives you a map that says these places in orange are 6 to 25 units, the reds are less than 5 or fewer than 5, and then everything in between. And then the last part of filters is really unique for points, is that you can combine filters together, meaning that you can filter by, let's say, number of units and years the LITEX program started. So we can go earlier in 2010. So now these are all the LITEX points that are 51 and more units that were started from 2010 or earlier in that query. And then probably the last thing that we had added recently is the ability just to customize the points. And the benefit of this is that sometimes the default points that we have within PolicyMap might not match what you're trying to visualize. And so we just wanted to give users some of that ability to change the icons a little bit, or even the shapes and such. All right, so that's kind of the basics of the map itself. Yeah. So any other questions, let me know. I do apologize if we're having some visual and technical problems for anyone else. Luckily, this is recorded. Hopefully it's recorded well, and I'll be sure to answer the questions afterwards.
So I was just curious about my question around race within a data set. So looking at diversity within housing, for example. Mm-hmm. So, and something that I thought was really interesting that I thought was new was under, maybe it was housing, housing where you do look at the cost burden. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so if you go down to affordability and cost burden, and then you carry it over to, there you go. The households by age, I thought that was a new statistic that I hadn't seen before. And so I was just wondering if like you could know households by race. So I'm guessing if you could, it would be there, but just thought I'd ask.
Yeah, so this is probably one of the nicer things about the new menus is that the age group was always there. It was just getting to it was probably a bit of a hassle. So this made this menu a little more clear.
Mm-hmm.
Now, because, I mean, this is the nice thing about the tool is that while we do have the two different types of data sets, which is persons of color or non-white population and cost burdens,
Mm-hmm.
where
Mm-hmm.
the ACS doesn't do the calculation here, we can then use the multi-layer maps to see where those two layers might start intersecting. So yeah, let's jump there and we'll kind of show you how to overlay multiple layers then. All right, so the one thing you'll learn about the tool a little bit is that on the right-hand side, the single layer map is, as the name implies, the ability to look at one layer at a time. And the goal of single layers really is the ability to see all these different colors, and the different colors represents the different ranges that are available for that one layer. But as Lisa explained, it's like wanting to see how different types of data sets in PolicyMap might intersect is the ability to actually start overlaying them together. So we call it the multi-layer function. And it's just that, meaning the ability to overlay multiple layers of data. So this little message here will eventually change once we do a big upgrade to the back end. But for now, the reason why it's telling you this is that your browser can only draw so much data at a time before we crash it. And so because of this, there's two ways to resolve this really sometimes annoying message. The first is just to simply zoom in far enough until you get to a geography that it can render, in this case, which is tracks. The other, which is probably just as easy, is to change the shade by to the underlying aggregation of the map to a larger geography. So in this case, it's currently at census tracts, and we just want to move this up to maybe zip codes, and the map will be able to render. And then what you'll see is in the case of multi-layer maps, there isn't a bunch of different colors or multiple different ranges. It's just one range. And that range then is up to you to identify what's being shown in the map. And in the case of percentage of homeowners that are under 65, well, we can go the other range, right? We want to go over 65. The majority of the data is well within this kind of by about 25 or 25%. And so we can either slide the bar on the right or on the left, or just simply just enter in the numbers themselves and just understand that the numbers on the left is greater than, and then the number on the right is less than. So if our goal is to try to identify places that have maybe a higher amount of persons or households over 65 cost burden, then we can bring this number up to, let's say, 25%. And so what the map will do is instead of trying to show you 100% of the range, it'll only show you the zip codes that have at least 25% of the households over 65 are cost burdened. And then as the name implies, it's a multi-layer map. So now we can add multiple layers onto the map, and we can add another one. And the other one was just talking about demographics and seeing if there's a racial aspect about this particular data set. And so to do this, we can add something very simple like non-white again. And again, the default geography will always be the smallest. And so we just need to bring this up one level. And then what we'll get, though, is a map that shows 100% of persons of color, but we're still within that first constraint of 25% of over 65 households cost burden. So again, we can move this bar and this needle up a little higher. So maybe our goal is to find a minimum of, it's going to be a very small range here, 5%. All right, we can move up a little more. And you can see as you change the numbers, the places that are queried are less and less. And so now only places in purple are zip codes that meet both criteria of at least 25% of the homeowners over 65 cost burden and at least 75% of the persons living here are persons of color. And then we can go and use the last one, I believe, and we can just do housing ownership and say, the nice thing about this one is it's already broken out by race. So we can say percentage of owners that are non-white. Again, the default is tracks. We move to zip codes. So now we have 3 layers, and the last layer that we had is added was home ownerships of non-white populations. And again, this number is very low, so we can bring this number down. Let's say no more than 5%. Yikes. Oh, maybe I really went too far on that. So now only places that meet all 3 criteria of at least 25% of the homeowners 65 are cost burden, 7% are persons of color, and then no more than 50% of the home ownerships are non-white in that same query. And so go ahead.
So I'm just, can you pull that up again? The data set? Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm like squinching my eyes to read it. So would it be fair to say in telling the story of this data set is exactly what I'm reading it to be?
Mm-hmm.
And so then there is true intersectionality between age and race and cost burden. They aren't separate. Is that correct?
I mean, well, in this particular case, the query is an AND function. So what it's telling you is that there's only a handful of places that meet this very specific intersection.
Correct.
Which is
okay.
The benefit of that you can identify these places based on that criteria. And the goal of this type of query is to say, these are the places that we want to focus our work in because they're meeting this very specific criteria.
Totally. Can you zoom in on Missoula perchance so we could see it at a little bit more localized level, like in our city county? Because it definitely looks like it's going up towards East Missoula as far as I can see.
This is the whole zip code too, so it's not just the track or so.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so it's all of zip code 802.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, zip code tabulation area. I really should put my glasses on.
I mean, we can change this. We can reduce this to tracks, just to give that same query.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that would be cool. Let's just see. Where did you just jump to? That was fast.
So I changed in the shade by for all the data layers in here.
Oh, I see. Okay. Mm-hmm.
So now, if we zoom in, yeah, so these are just the 3 tracks that meet the criteria.
Okay, does anybody else find this interesting, or am I just talking to myself?
No, I definitely find it interesting, Lisa. I'm trying to kind of absorb what this all means. We don't necessarily know, like in terms of the intersectionality, we don't necessarily know that these are the same people.
That's correct.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
That's
okay.
Correct.
Yep. Okay.
Yeah, the
that
goal
makes sense to me.
That's exactly how the query is supposed to work. And yeah, that's a very fair assumption because the way the data is, it's not trying to look at the same persons, it's just trying to look at how the data for those people are intersecting as well. So
that is the aha moment.
Yeah, because even the data that it's pulling from is aggregate data. It's not individualized data. Is that right?
That's right. Yep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes so much sense. Okay, thank you for explaining that to me.
Yeah, and then the goal of the AND query, the initial query for multi-layers, is really to try to identify places that are meeting very specific criteria. And maybe you're running a program and that program is trying to use these pieces of data to identify neighborhoods that might benefit from very specific types of funding or programs. And that's really what the initial query is trying to do, is give you that tool to identify those places based on that. If you're trying to do maybe a bit of research, and I think I showed this the last time we talked about the tool, and that's the ability to start understanding the surrounding neighborhoods. Because again, this right now is just saying these places meet these very specific criteria, but what about the neighborhoods around it? And so we added another function into multi-layers, and that's the OR function. So instead of seeing the intersection of data, we'll start looking at the overlap of that data. And then this one's always going to be a little median resource. But what this is going to try to do then is tell a much different story. It'll still tell you that these places meet all 3 criteria that you created in the legend, but now you can start understanding why maybe the surrounding neighborhoods didn't fall into it. So in this case, this particular tract didn't meet any of the percentage of, well, that's 100% non-white ownership. That's pretty amazing, as well as over 65 cost burden, but it only met 1 criteria of the 3. And then as you kind of navigate around the neighborhoods, so this map is probably a more telling story of the surrounding neighborhoods, not just the individual places that you're trying to identify. So there could be chances that these surrounding neighborhoods have more characteristics of places that you're trying to identify with, and because they're slightly off from another one of your criteria, that's the only reason why.
But can you hover back over that last place that you were hovering? I just want to make sure I'm understanding this correctly. Okay, so the one that's gray right there, percent non-white households who own a home. So that means in that census tract, among all of the non-white households that live in that census tract, 86% of them own a home.
That's correct.
Okay.
And we can change this. So maybe that percentage, that percentage is sometimes, especially in the case of non-white home ownerships, it's a little telling, because when you look at something that says 100% and you're like, what does that really mean? You can change that, and maybe count is maybe a better variable to get that at. And so now we can bring this number down and say we're looking at a minimum of 500 households that are non-white home ownerships. I'm hoping that renders. Yeah, you can really see how far that number really goes then. Maybe 200. You can see it's 160. So 86% represents 160 of the total non-white population in that tract.
Cool, thank you.
Yeah, and the goal of, and don't mind some of this sometimes, the goal of this type of query really is more about trying to see how relatable the surrounding neighborhoods are to the query that you just did for the intersection of data. So that way, instead of just focusing on just these places that meet the criteria, now you have a better understanding of maybe the surrounding neighborhoods as well. And that's really one of the main reasons we created an and an or function for the queries.
This is awesome. I feel like in the last training of this I sat in on, I remember asking about and logic versus or logic.
Yep.
and so that's awesome that you guys added the or function.
Yeah. I think we had I think when I did this last time for you guys, the or function was in our beta, and I took us to the beta to show you it because I was pretty excited to show you how it works. But yeah, now it's live. The one thing you will see is that it is pretty intensive on the querying, so you might have that spinning wheel a little bit, and just understand that it's trying to do a pretty unique process in that. All right, so let me show you some last things about the boundaries and the data. Hopefully those 2 things, being able to show you single layer maps, just looking at one layer at a time is very powerful. Being able to customize the data is very powerful. But then the multi-layer maps, as you can see, the goal of that is to give you a bit of a spatial tool that you can start overlaying multiple pieces of data, cutting up those ranges to find out hopefully places that meet very specific criteria. And the goal of that is if you're working on a program or you're just trying to identify neighborhoods that meet very unique criteria, the multi-layers is one of these very unique ways to do that. And then the last thing I just sort of skipped a little bit, but I kind of wanted to get us into data, is we initially talked about what we call predefined boundaries within PolicyMap, so boundaries that already exist within the tool, but definitely understand that you guys have custom boundaries in that process. And for us, custom boundaries are either a containment of roads or a radius around an address or a point, or even an assembly of other geographies. And so that is available on the very top right-hand button there, which is the custom regions. And then with this, there are 3 unique ways to make a custom region. The draw is just that. You're simply just drawing on top of the map. There's 2 ways to draw on the map as well. You can actually just do the pencil, which is you're clicking and dragging your mouse around. But the point is neat because you can actually click onto the map and it will draw the vertices of your target area. It'll save my previous boundary, which I use pink. You can zoom in to get close to the street level. You can still pan around. And if you've used the tool before, you're going to really appreciate how intuitive it is now and how fast it is. But when you draw a custom region, and it's simply just that, you can still make fixes if you wanted to. So that way, if you make an error, you can correct boundaries and such. But when you're done, click Save and Close, and this will give you an easy way to give it a custom name. So a drawn custom region in our tool is really unique because it doesn't care about any of the underlying boundaries that it might sit on top of. So meaning that it doesn't care that you cross block groups, tracks, city lines, zip codes, county lines, state lines, congressional districts, and so forth. It will care about these boundaries when you want to download data for it or get a report for it or get some type of aggregation for it. It'll use a really simple 50% coverage rule, meaning that at least 50% of the tracks needs to sit within your custom region. So in this case, this track probably would not be, this would probably, definitely not. And you can start kind of seeing how the capture works. And this is very helpful because there's no correct way to divide a census tract or any boundary really in PolicyMap or from the census. And so this will give you an idea that if maybe tracks isn't the right aggregation for this place because it's such a unique boundary, maybe you want to use block groups in the aggregation. And so this allows you to get more boundaries captured because the containment rule of 50% will capture more boundaries in that sense.
Can you explain more about that containment rule of 50%? Does it mean like if your custom boundary, so if I'm just having trouble like understanding which way it works. Like,
sure. So the geography that you're trying to aggregate for, that boundary has to have at least 50% of its area in your custom region. So in this example, pretty much most of these down here would, whereas this one touches it, it would not, because only a sliver of it really would be contained. And so
yeah, but I just like don't understand really like then what happens with that. So it doesn't have 50% of your boundary, or at least 50% of this, the block group is not within your boundary. So then what?
It'll just ignore it in the aggregation.
Okay.
Yeah. So a way to get around that then is basically to make a boundary of those geographies. And so to do that, you're going to use the option to assemble custom region. So the draw feature, really the goal of this is like sometimes we have many users that just have a handful of roads or landmarks that are trying to draw a boundary based off of that. And then other times they have a list of geographies or an address to do a radius by. So the assemble region just simply allows you to take the boundaries that are in PolicyMap and click to assemble by. You can use the default geography, or you can be very granular and use smaller geographies or even larger geographies. And again, just depending on how you want to use the tool. So we'll use block groups. We'll zoom in a little bit. Let me just get rid of this. And so this allows us to simply click onto the map. There's no containment rules on this. It's simply whatever you select in the map is exactly what you're going to aggregate the data by.
You know what I think is an interesting block group analogy is if you go in, if you underneath Orchard Homes, right where you're at, right there. And I think Jessica is on the call with the food bank. River Road is in 2 block groups, if not 3 block groups. And that, oh no, it's 2. It's sitting over by the river. It's in 2 block groups. It's just really interesting in our neighborhoods. when we're trying to pull census tracts out of neighborhoods, that we have to go down to block groups, and sometimes our block group data is very different from one side of the tracks or side of the river to the other. And so I think that rural nature of, Missoula, Montana comes out in that way. And so we have to be careful when we tell the story of a neighborhood about when we're using block group data, I guess, is what I've learned over the years.
Yeah, that's probably one of the biggest challenges of just rural data in general, is that this block group here, because majority of it is probably national park and mountains, where people that live are probably just in this very small part right here, and that part represents the entire block group. And yeah, it's hard to tell that story when you want to talk about this boundary here, and somebody sees this and say, well, why is there only 2,000 people that live in that block group or so?
Yeah. Maybe I should ask the city if I can redraw the neighborhood boundaries.
So one of the things that we do have plans for 2022 is we will have parcel data down. Well, we'll have parcel boundaries. Maybe not data, but at the very least, you'll be able to see the parcels in these block groups, and it'll give you much more context when you're trying to talk about a block group then. Yeah, the one challenge is you'll find out from the census is that the smallest data they have is the census block, which is small. It's the grouping of blocks make a block group. The margin of error for blocks is just so extreme that it's not very helpful to be able to do analysis against it sometimes.
It's usually too small.
Yeah. Yeah.
But there's no data.
Yeah, or the margin of error is the entire value of the
correct.
Stuff, yeah. So the assemble custom region, again, the same ability to give it a name. I don't know why I have this beautiful pink color boundary, but so custom regions, once you do create them, they'll be available here. They'll also be available in your menu. And as you can see from this menu here, you can share custom regions with other users, either directly from the menu here or from your save menu. So what this allows you to do is put a custom region you create into another user's account. And that way that person does not have to redraw anything. And then once it's available on your account, then you can work with that boundary and then do your own analysis, be it change the boundaries, doing updates, or downloading data for that boundary.
So if I created a boundary, for example, I could just share it out with the rest of the team.
That's correct.
And say, hey, I just did this boundary. So like the Northside Diamond parcel half mile, I did that. So
yeah, I stole that from your...
a long time ago. Yeah. And basically that was to leverage the Catholic Diocese Church into donating their land around the park there, the Diamond, to let them know what the population was that was within, like, I think 3 or 4 blocks of the Diamond, so that they could access some green space to really work on our park deficit needs and green space for physical activity and play and mental health and trees and all that. So really, I just want to empower you all that if you have opportunities for, some kind of resource for your program agency clients, that you can really use this power of PolicyMap to tell the story.
Exactly. And what I've really shown you today is probably the tip of the iceberg when it comes to using the tool. There's a lot you can do in here. I hate overwhelming users to how to use the application. The mapping side of it is probably one of the most powerful way to use PolicyMap, but there's things like you can download all the data in PolicyMap into Excel spreadsheets, which then you can add into your own analysis if you wanted to. There's unique ways to do that. You can upload your data into the tool, which then you can join to data in PolicyMap, giving you some really unique ways to do analysis. So all this is in various tutorials. I'll send all this as links, but if there's an interest to do much more in-depth stuff, I'm always happy to answer and just go through a very quick session as well for anyone.
Is there a training about how to download the data into an Excel file?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, I'll send that in the link.
Okay, super. Naomi, I'm thinking of you.